How are you doing today? You are welcome to Eko Learners Support once again for WAEC and NECO candidates. My name is Emmanuel Shion, and I will be teaching you history. Today, we'll be looking at transatlantic slave trade. Transatlantic slave trade. At the end of today's class, students will 1. Explain the nature of transatlantic slave trade. 2. Students will explain the reasons for the introduction of transatlantic slave trade. 3. Students will discuss the organization of transatlantic slave trade. And lastly, we'll look at the effect of transatlantic slave trade on Africa. What is transatlantic slave trade? Transatlantic slave trade is a trade that lasted from the 16th to the 19th century. It was one of the most brutal and most inhuman system of forced labor in history. This trade involves the transportation of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the America, where they were sold into slavery. The transatlantic slave trade involves the forceful migration of an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans from their country through the Atlantic Ocean to America. The majority of the enslaved Africans were forced to work on plantations in the Americas, particularly in Caribbean area of America. This trade has to do with intense and intensive hard labor, whereby Africans are being made to work on plantations, to work as domestic slaves, among others. Enslaved individuals were subjected to extreme harsh working conditions. Harsh working conditions, and often working from sunrise to sunset with little rest and little or no food or drink. They were given minimal food, like I said earlier, inadequate shelter, and were regularly subjected to what? Physical, brutal punishment to enforce discipline. So this transatlantic slave trade is not only buying slaves from Africa, but the enslaved people were being made to face inhuman punishment, suffering, and a lot of agonies. Reasons for introduction of transatlantic slave trade. Number 1, the main reason for the introduction was as a result of the shortage and the demand of human capital in Europe. It was at a point whereby in Europe they are in need of human capital who could work for hours in order to get effective production on plantations like sugarcane and others. 2, high demand for cash crops. Europe was in need of high cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, among others. 3, there were existing African slavery. Now, previous class we talked about that slavery actually existed before the pre-colonial era, although it was not as inhuman as the transatlantic slave trade. As a result of the existing slavery by some customs and tradition of some society, it also led to the introduction of the transatlantic slave trade. 4, European nations such as Portugal, Spain were in intense competition for colonial expansion. Some European powers are competing among themselves in order to have a higher colonial expansion. Also, there were a series of establishment of new plantations and the expansion of existing ones. New plantations are being established in Europe, and there is need for human resources who will work effectively on these plantations in order to get a meaningful production. Also, Africans were perceived as more resilient to the harsh weather conditions and diseases that was affecting the Americans as at that time. There is this belief and assumption that black people are more energetic and can be able to work in harsh working conditions under some unfavorable weather condition. That's part of the motive behind the introduction of the transatlantic slave trade. Moving forward, organization of transatlantic slave trade. It's very important that the trade system that took place during the organization is known as the triangular trade system. Triangular trade system. If you look at the diagram on the screen, this diagram showcases the shape of triangle. The transatlantic slave trade was a highly organized and complex system that involves multiple stages, 3 major stages, different kinds of people, 3 regions or continents: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The trade was conducted through a well-established network of European traders, African leaders and merchants, chiefs, captains, and plantation owners. We have 3 major steps, like I've said earlier, for the triangular trade system of the transatlantic slave trade. The starting point, which is known as the first leg, is from Europe. Starts from Europe. Europe to Africa. European goods such as alcohol, fireworks, mirrors, and the likes are being exported to Africa. When they arrived in Africa, they met with the African rulers, they talked to them, presented the goods to the African rulers, such as mirrors. They tried to lure the African rulers in exchange for people. Then after that, the second leg, which is known as the brutal leg or step or stage, is known as the Middle Passage. It is the second leg from Africa to the Americas. This leg involves the transportation of enslaved. After the Europeans has gotten the people from the African rulers, they transport them to the Americas. During the course of the transportation across the Atlantic Ocean, the journey was very brutal. The enslaved Africans went for days without eating, went for days without drinking, went for days with severe punishment in order to imbibe discipline. They were being chained, their necks, their legs, their hands, to prevent them from running away. It is known as the most notorious part of the transatlantic slave trade as a result of the inhuman conditions. The third leg, which is the last leg, is from America to Europe. After selling the enslaved Africans into the Americans, the ships were loaded with raw materials produced by the slave labor. When they go to America, they were being used to what? To work on plantations, to work under harsh working conditions. So the produce, the raw materials that has been produced, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, will then be transported back to Europe for sale. So that was how it went. From Europe down to Africa, went along with textile, rums, alcohol, other manufactured goods. When they get to Africa, they exchange these goods for slaves. They take the slaves to America. When they get to America, the slaves work on the plantations. After getting raw materials, after working on the plantations and getting the produce, after making a lot of production, this production such as sugar and tobacco, which is the final goods, will be sent back to Europe. Be sent back to Europe. Then it continues like that, which forms the triangular trade system. You see that the shape is more a triangle. Moving forward, effect of transatlantic slave trade. Transatlantic slave trade has devastating effect on Africa. Number one is population loss. Like I've said earlier, they have lost about 12 to 15 million Africans. It led to depopulation of Africa as a continent. Then trauma and psychological effects. The experience was traumatic. It left scars in the mind and heart of those who involve or engage in this trade those that are being enslaved, not only them, including their family members, their wives, their husband, their children, even generations to come. It was traumatic. 3. Legacy of racism and discrimination. Yes. One of the legacies, there are some scholars who has argued that one of the legacies of racism and discrimination nowadays between the whites, the Europeans, and Africans, one of the legacy was the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade. This is why some of the Europeans see themselves, they find themselves superior over the black race. 4. Increased warfare and political instability. As at that time, many regions who were engaged in the slave trade, they waged war against each other in order to get slaves, because as at that time, the trade was economical. Slave market. There are some markets that are meant for buying and selling of goods. Unfortunately, there are some markets that are meant for the buying and selling of slaves. All this causes devastating effects on Africa. Now, to the practice question. Person say, highlight positive impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. This is a question that has brought about different arguments and perspectives. Although there is no amount of positive impact that can be seen in the transatlantic slave trade that could measure up the negative effect, the inhuman experience, punishment, sorrow, and agony that was experienced by the enslaved. However, we should not shy away from some positive impacts. Number 1, the introduction of European goods. Through the trade, there were importation of European goods. European goods such as firearms, textiles, alcohol, metal tools. Although these metal tools and firearms also caused some negative effects, because when some of the societies, when they get hold of those firearms, they also use it against one another in terms of war. But however, the introduction of some of these European goods is of good to some certain extent to the Africans. Number 2 is technological exchange. Said it earlier that the Africans also gained access to some European technologies, such as the firearms, among others. 3, introduction of new crops. Some African regions benefited from the introduction of new crops from the Americas, such as maize, peanuts, and others. 4, wealth accumulation. As a result of the trade, a lot of African regions generated a lot of wealth from this trade. In fact, the slave trade was one of the major revenue of most of the states and region, empires and kingdoms during this era. Having said that, it is imperative to also restate that these positive impacts do not overweigh the negative effects, the social, economic, and political disruption caused by the slave trade. The negative effect outweighed all these positive impacts, because millions of people were enslaved and killed. There were breakdown of communities, violence, economic underdevelopment in Africa as a continent. This is the end of today's class.
Eko Learners Support, a support program of the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education for WAEC and NECO candidates.
I hope you enjoyed today's class. If you have any comments, observation, or suggestion, kindly reach us in any of our social media platforms displayed on the screen. Thank you for watching.